A torch flickers against limestone walls, casting elongated shadows that twitch like ghosts. Moisture drips steadily in the background, while a thin veil of smoke clings to the ceiling. In this moment, 30,000 years ago, a young human steps deeper into the unknown. The air cools, the light weakens. Each footstep is a choice, to enter a realm of fear. Caves were not shelters. They were thresholds, liminal spaces between the world of the living and the imagined domain of spirits, predators, and mystery. Why then did our ancestors go in? What compelled them to brave such visceral unease? This journey takes us through that fear, real, rational, and evolutionarily effective. If deep history fascinates you, consider subscribing for more. Because to understand what scared them underground is to understand what still haunts us now. In the dim underworld of ancient Europe, danger had claws. Chevet Cave, dated to around 32,000 years ago, contains not only vivid paintings, but also the skeletal remains of cave bears, a species that outweighed grizzlies and dominated cave interiors. These weren't passive fossils. Scratch marks on walls suggest territorial behavior. Alongside them, striped hyenas, powerful scavengers with bone-crushing jaws, likely prowled cave entrances, waiting for an opportunity. For early humans, these caves weren't vacant shelters. They were battlegrounds with apex predators. One fringe theory suggests some humans left meat offerings to appease these beasts, treating them as more than animals, perhaps as cave spirits. Scholars still debate whether humans and predators alternated cave occupancy seasonally or had violent confrontations. But the presence of clawed bones and gnawed skulls tells a clear story. Venturing underground wasn't just spiritual. It was survival in hostile territory. Deep underground, silence doesn't exist. Instead, there are echoes, distorted, shifting, alive. In Spain's Altamira Cave, researchers have found that certain chambers amplify sound in uncanny ways. A single clap bounces unpredictably, while footsteps vanish, then reappear like whispers from invisible mouths. For prehistoric minds, such phenomena likely signaled presence. Not the comforting kind, but something else, other. Some scholars believe these sounds gave rise to early notions of spirits or disembodied watchers in the dark. An unusual theory posits that humans used caves for primitive sound testing rituals, clapping or chanting until a responsive chamber was found. Only then would they paint. Scholars still debate whether acoustics shaped ritual placement, but the overlap between echo-rich zones and cave art locations is no accident. For ancient humans, sound underground didn't merely fill space. It suggested intelligence, presence, and power. Fear of being heard and answered may have been part of the point. In El Cedrón Cave in northern Spain, the remains of at least 13 Neanderthals lie hidden far from natural light. Their bones, dated to around 49,000 years ago, suggest purposeful placement deep underground. Similar patterns appear in Brunikehl Cave, where broken stalagmites form rings around charred areas, hinting at a ceremonial or funerary function. Why transport the dead into such foreboding spaces? One mainstream idea is spiritual. Perhaps the depths symbolized an afterlife or a womb-like return to the earth. But there's another possibility. Fear, containment. Keep death and its energies confined where few dared go. Some fringe interpretations suggest caves were considered thin places, where life, death, and the beyond brushed shoulders. Burying the dead there could have been part reverence, part quarantine. Scholars still debate whether these burials were acts of devotion or dread. Yet repeatedly, across time and continents, our ancestors chose the dark to house their dead. The cave walls of Lascaux, painted some 17,000 years ago, are adorned with galloping horses, antlered stags, and cryptic symbols. But what's often overlooked is where these paintings are found, not in broad, accessible chambers, but down twisting corridors far from daylight. Creating them required crawling, torch-bearing, and a tolerance for suffocating fear. Why make art in such places? One prevailing theory suggests spiritual intent. The deeper the art, the closer to the spirits. But it could also be that fear sharpened meaning. The act of painting where one's breath echoed back in strange tones may have transformed imagery into something sacred. Fringe interpretations even propose that entering the cave was itself the ritual, the art, an offering to entities within. Scholars still debate whether these paintings were magical, mnemonic, or meditative. What's undeniable is this: the most enduring prehistoric masterpieces weren't made in comfort, but where fear hummed just beneath the surface. In the depths of Grotte de Cussac, France, where human remains share space with intricate engravings, researchers have found tantalizing signs of ritual behavior. Circles of stone, ochre stains, and carefully placed bones. This site, dated to around 25,000 years ago, suggests that underground spaces weren't just tombs or art studios. They were theaters for complex, possibly unsettling acts. Charcoal deposits hint at fire-driven ceremonies. Fragmented remains raise the possibility of dismemberment or sacrifice. While mainstream scholars tread carefully around the idea of ritual bloodshed, patterns in cave sites suggest something more than burial or artistry. One fringe theory posits that caves served as prehistoric healing sites, where illness was exorcised or pain externalized through symbolic acts. Scholars still debate whether such practices were acts of reverence, medicine, or terror. But when bones and pigments meet in tight, airless spaces, it's hard not to see the cave as a crucible, where fear, belief, and the unknown collided. Deep within the Chauvet and Tuc d'Oldobert caves, archaeologists have found something unexpected. Tiny footprints, likely left by children. Some prints even show signs of playful movement, shuffling, slipping, or dancing steps made barefoot in near total darkness. At Tuc, one child's prints accompany those of a wolf, eerily parallel, raising questions no one can quite answer. Why bring children into such dangerous spaces? Was it rite of passage, a family ritual, or something darker? Perhaps the presence of children gave legitimacy to sacred ceremonies, or perhaps they were believed to carry a spiritual sensitivity adults had lost. Fringe theorists suggest that children were considered intermediaries, less tethered to the physical world, and thus more attuned to spirits. Scholars still debate whether these visits were sacred, social, or symbolic, but the image remains haunting. A small figure, torch in hand, pressing footprints into clay no daylight ever touched. Torches weren't just for light. They were lifelines. Made from pine resin, twisted bark, or fat-soaked reeds, they hissed and flared in the damp breath of caves. At sites like Neo in France, charred torch ends still lie where ancient hands dropped them. But fire didn't just illuminate the path, it held fear at bay. To early humans, the flicker of flame wasn't merely useful, it was symbolic. It kept shadows at a distance, revealed predators, and anchored sanity in a world without walls or sky. In flickering light, monstrous shapes turned to stone. Darkness, absolute, suffocating, became bearable only through flame. Some fringe ideas link torch rituals to purification, where fire cleansed cave energy before rituals or burials. Scholars still debate whether fire was just a tool or a spiritual shield. Either way, every trip underground came with fire, and perhaps with the unspoken fear of losing it. Somewhere in the blackness, stories began. The flickering walls of caves likely served as the first cinemas, surfaces where light, shadow, and imagination merged. In Trois Frères Cave, painted hybrid figures, part man, part beast, hint at narratives beyond the visual. These weren't just images, they may have been characters in oral traditions born underground. Imagine a group, huddled around firelight, listening to tales of spirits who lived in the stone, of beasts that punished trespassers. Caves gave those myths setting, sound, and gravitas. The fear they evoked wasn't accidental. It was the fertile soil of myth. One fringe theory suggests cave paintings were mnemonic devices, visual cues to anchor spoken stories or chants. Scholars still debate whether the earliest myths came from the caves or merely found resonance there. But it's likely that underground fear didn't just haunt our ancestors. It helped them remember, share, and believe. Caves collapse. It's a grim reality known to modern cavers, and likely to Paleolithic ones too. At the entrance of Chauvet Cave, rockfalls sealed entire corridors, preserving art for tens of thousands of years. But that preservation came at a cost. For ancient humans, witnessing a collapse may have been the stuff of collective trauma. There are no direct records, of course, but fractured bones found near blocked passages hint at tragedy. Over time, such events could morph into stories, warnings, rituals, taboos. Don't go too deep. Don't anger the cave. Myths don't always arise from imagination. They often grow from disaster. Some fringe thinkers suggest that post-collapse caves became revered, treated as cursed, sacred, or both. Scholars still debate whether these memories were preserved through oral history or genetic caution. But fear, once learned, lingers. And caves that once swallowed people whole may have taught communities to fear and respect the thresholds of nature. Just before the descent begins, strange marks often appear. Scratches, dots, handprints, or animal figures clustered near cave mouths. At El Castillo, red discs and stencils date back over 40,000 years, as if announcing the boundary between two worlds. These weren't decorations. They were signals. Some believe these symbols acted as warnings, visual cues that what lay beyond was not ordinary. Others suggest they were protective, charms to ward off danger or spiritual contamination. At the very least, they marked transition, a threshold not to be crossed lightly. A fringe idea claims that such symbols weren't for the living at all, but for the spirits inside, a kind of permission slip before entry. Scholars still debate whether these signs were territorial, spiritual, or functional. But again and again, our ancestors marked cave entrances, not exits. What waited inside demanded acknowledgement, respect, and perhaps a little fear. In the cold, wet dark of Paleolithic caves, fear wasn't a flaw, it was a tool. The human mind evolved to respond to threats with hyper-awareness, pattern-seeking, and story-making. Caves activated all three. In places like Chauvet and El Cedrón, we find not just the remnants of culture, but traces of the emotional states that shaped it. Modern neuroscientists have noted how darkness heightens imagination and anxiety. Our ancestors, too, likely felt the pulse quicken, the breath catch, the sense of presence behind them. And yet, they returned. Again and again. Fear didn't stop them, it focused them. One fringe theory even suggests that underground dread triggered altered mental states, proto-spiritual trances perhaps, or intense social bonding. Scholars still debate whether caves enhanced ritual, myth, or memory most. But what's certain is that prehistoric fear wasn't just survival instinct, it was an engine. And deep in the dark, that engine drove some of humanity's first big leaps. Conclusion. What began as trembling steps into the dark turned out to be a journey inward, into the mind, into myth, into meaning. Caves were more than places, they were mirrors for the primal human psyche. Beneath the earth, in silence and flickering light, our ancestors faced not just predators or pitfalls, but the invisible architecture of fear itself. And instead of fleeing, they painted, they buried, they remembered. From the bear-haunted corridors of Chauvet to the echoing chambers of Altamira, we see how fear became fuel, how dread shaped behavior, belief, even beauty. Scholars still sift through the evidence, still debate the intentions behind each footprint and flick of ochre. But the message seems clear. What scared us most taught us most. In many ways, it still does. So next time fear flickers in the dark, listen. It might be ancient, it might be wise.